The princess, David Herbert Lawrence. To her father, she was the princess. To her Boston aunts and uncles she was just Dolly Urquhart. Poor little thing, Colin Urquhart was just a bit mad. He was of an old Scottish family, and he claimed royal blood. The blood of Scottish kings flowed in his veins. On this point, his American relatives said, he was just a bit off. They could not bear any more to be told which royal blood of Scotland blued his veins. The whole thing was rather ridiculous, and a sore point. The only fact they remembered was that it was not Stuart. He was a handsome man, with a wide-open blue eye that seemed sometimes to be looking at nothing, soft black hair brushed rather low on his low, broad brow, and a very attractive body. Add to this a most beautiful speaking voice, usually rather hushed and diffident, but sometimes resonant and powerful like bronze, and you have the sum of his charms. He looked like some old Celtic hero. He looked as if he should have worn a greyish kilt and a sporran, and shown his knees. His voice came direct out of the hushed Ossianic past. For the rest, he was one of those gentlemen of sufficient but not excessive means who 50 years ago wandered vaguely about, never arriving anywhere, never doing anything, and never definitely being anything, yet well received in the good society of more than one country. He did not marry till he was nearly 40, and then it was a wealthy Miss Prescott, from New England. Hannah Prescott at 22 was fascinated by the man with the soft black hair not yet touched by grey, and the wide, rather vague blue eyes. Many women had been fascinated before her. But Colin Urquhart, by his very vagueness, had avoided any decisive connection. Mrs. Urquhart lived 3 years in the mist and glamour of her husband's presence. And then it broke her. It was like living with a fascinating spectre. About most things he was completely, even ghostly oblivious. He was always charming, courteous, perfectly gracious in that hushed, musical voice of his. But absent. When all came to all, he just wasn't there. Not all there, as the vulgar say. He was the father of the little girl she bore at the end of the first year. But this did not substantiate him the more. His very beauty and his haunting musical quality became dreadful to her after the first few months. The strange echo? He was like a living echo. His very flesh, when you touched it, did not seem quite the flesh of a real man. Perhaps it was that he was a little bit mad. She thought it definitely the night her baby was born. So my little princess has come at last," he said, in his throaty, singing Celtic voice, like a glad chant, swaying absorbed. It was a tiny, frail baby, with wide, amazed blue eyes. They christened it Mary Henrietta. She called the little thing my dolly. He called it always my princess. It was useless to fly at him. He just opened his wide blue eyes wider, and took a childlike, silent dignity there was no getting past. Hannah Prescott had never been robust. She had no great desire to live. So when the baby was 2 years old she suddenly died. The Prescotts felt a deep but unadmitted resentment against Colin Urquhart. They said he was selfish. Therefore they discontinued Hannah's income, a month after her burial in Florence, after they had urged the father to give the child over to them, and he had courteously, musically, but quite finally refused. He treated the Prescotts as if they were not of his world, not realities to him, just casual phenomena, or gramophones, talking machines that had to be answered. He answered them. But of their actual existence he was never once aware. They debated having him certified unsuitable to be guardian of his own child. But that would have created a scandal. So they did the simplest thing, after all washed their hands of him. But they wrote scrupulously to the child, and sent her modest presents of money at Christmas, and on the anniversary of the death of her mother. To the princess her Boston relatives were for many years just a nominal reality. She lived with her father, and he traveled continually, though in a modest way, living on his moderate income. And never going to America. The child changed nurses all the time. In Italy it was a contadina, in India she had Naya, in Germany she had a yellow-haired peasant girl. Father and child were inseparable. He was not a recluse. Wherever he went he was to be seen paying formal calls, going out to luncheon or to tea, rarely to dinner. And always with the child. People called her Princess Urquhart, as if that were her christened name. She was a quick, dainty little thing with dark gold hair that went a soft brown, and wide, slightly prominent blue eyes that were at once so candid and so knowing. She was always grown up, she never really grew up. Always strangely wise, and always childish. It was her father's fault. My little princess must never take too much notice of people and the things they say and do, he repeated to her. People don't know what they are doing and saying. They chatter, and they hurt one another, and they hurt themselves very often, till they cry. But don't take any notice, my little princess. Because it is all nothing. Inside everybody there is another creature, a demon which doesn't care at all. You peel away all the things they say and do and feel, as cook peels away the outside of the onions. And in the middle of everybody there is a green demon which you can't peel away. And this green demon never changes, and it doesn't care at all about all the things that happen to the outside leaves of the person, all the chatter, and all the husbands and wives and children, and troubles and fusses. You peel everything away from people, and there is a green, upright demon in every man and woman, and this demon is a man's real self, and a woman's real self. It doesn't really care about anybody, it belongs to the demons and the primitive fairies, who never care. But, even so, there are big demons and mean demons, and splendid demonish fairies, and vulgar ones. But there are no royal fairy women left. Only you, my little princess. You are the last of the royal race of the old people, the last, my princess. There are no others. You and I are the last. When I am dead there will be only you. And that is why, darling, you will never care for any of the people in the world very much. Because their demons are all dwindled and vulgar. They are not royal. Only you are royal, after me. Always remember that. And always remember, it is a great secret. If you tell people, they will try to kill you, because they will envy you for being a princess. It is our great secret, darling. I am a prince, and you a princess, of the old blood. And we keep our secret between us, all alone. And so, darling, you must treat all people very politely, because noblesse oblige. But you must never forget that you alone are the last of princesses, and that all other are less than you are, less noble, more vulgar. Treat them politely and gently and kindly, darling. But you are the princess, and they are commoners. Never try to think of them as if they were like you. They are not. You will find, always, that they are lacking in the royal touch, which only you have. The princess learned her lesson early, the first lesson, of absolute reticence, the impossibility of intimacy with any other than her father, the second lesson, of naive, slightly benevolent politeness. As a small child, something crystallized in her character, making her clear and finished, and as impervious as crystal. Dear child, her hostesses said of her. She is so quaint and old-fashioned, such a lady. Poor little mite, she was erect, and very dainty. Always small, nearly tiny in physique, she seemed like a changeling beside her big, handsome, slightly mad father. She dressed very simply, usually in blue or delicate grays, with little collars of old Milan point, or very finely worked linen. She had exquisite little hands, that made the piano sound like a spinet when she played. She was rather given to wearing cloaks and capes, instead of coats, out of doors, and little 18th century sort of hats. Her complexion was pure apple blossom, she looked as if she had stepped out of a picture. But no one, to her dying day, ever knew exactly the strange picture her father had framed her in and from which she never stepped. Her grandfather and grandmother and her Aunt Maud demanded twice to see her, once in Rome and once in Paris. Each time they were charmed, piqued, and annoyed. She was so exquisite and such a little virgin. At the same time so knowing and so oddly assured. That odd, assured touch of condescension, and the inward coldness, infuriated her American relations, only she really fascinated her grandfather. He was spellbound, in a way, in love with the little faultless thing. His wife would catch him brooding, musing over his grandchild, long months after the meeting, and craving to see her again. He cherished to the end the fond hope that she might come to live with him and her grandmother. Thank you so much, grandfather. You are so very kind. But Papa and I are such an old couple, you see, such a crotchety old couple, living in a world of our own. Her father let her see the world from the outside. And he let her read. When she was in her teens she read Zola and Maupassant, and with the A's of Zola and Maupassant she looked on Paris. A little later she read Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. The latter confused her. The others, she seemed to understand with a very shrewd, canny understanding, just as she understood the Decameron stories as she read them in their old Italian, or the Nibelung poems. Strange and uncanny, she seemed to understand things in a cold light perfectly, with all the flush of fire absent. She was something like a changeling, not quite human. This earned her, also, strange antipathies. Cabmen and railway porters, especially in Paris and Rome, would suddenly treat her with brutal rudeness, when she was alone. They seemed to look on her with sudden violent antipathy. They sensed in her curious impertinence, an easy, sterile impertinence towards the things they felt most. She was so assured, and her flower of maidenhood was so scentless. She could look at a lusty, sensual Roman cabman as if he were a sort of grotesque, to make her smile. She knew all about him, in Zola and the peculiar condescension with which she would give him her order, as if she, frail, beautiful thing, were the only reality, and he, coarse monster, was a sort of Caliban floundering in the mud on the margin of the pool of the perfect lotus, would suddenly enrage the fellow. The real Mediterranean who prided himself on his beaut male, and to whom the phallic mystery was still the only mystery. And he would turn a terrible face on her, bully her in a brutal, coarse fashion hideous. For to him she had only the blasphemous impertinence of her own sterility. Encounters like these made her tremble, and made her know she must have support from the outside. The power of her spirit did not extend to these low people, and they had all the physical power. She realized an implacability of hatred in their turning on her. But she did not lose her head. She quietly paid out money and turned away. Those were dangerous moments, though, and she learned to be prepared for them. The princess she was, and the fairy from the north, and could never understand the volcanic phallic rage with which coarse people could turn on her in a paroxysm of hatred. They never turned on her father like that. And quite early she decided it was the New England mother in her whom they hated. Never for 1 minute could she see with the old Roman eyes, see herself as sterility, the barren flower taking on airs and an intolerable impertinence. This was what the Roman cabman saw in her. And he longed to crush the barren blossom. Its sexless beauty and its authority put him in a passion of brutal revolt. When she was 19 her grandfather died, leaving her a considerable fortune in the safe hands of responsible trustees. They would deliver her income, but only on condition that she resided for 6 months in the year in the United States. Why should they make me conditions? She said to her father. I refuse to be imprisoned 6 months in the year in the United States. We will tell them to keep their money. Let us be wise, my little princess, let us be wise. No, we are almost poor, and we are never safe from rudeness. I cannot allow anybody to be rude to me. I hate it, I hate it. His eyes flamed as he said it. I could kill any man or woman who is rude to me. But we are in exile in the world. We are powerless. If we were really poor, we should be quite powerless, and then I should die. No, my princess. Let us take their money, then they will not dare to be rude to us. Let us take it, as we put on clothes, to cover ourselves from their aggressions. There began a new phase, when the father and daughter spent their summers on the Great Lakes or in California, or in the Southwest. The father was something of a poet, the daughter something of a painter. He wrote poems about the lakes or the redwood trees, and she made dainty drawings. He was physically a strong man, and he loved the out-of-doors. He would go off with her for days, paddling in a canoe and sleeping by a campfire. Frail little princess, she was always undaunted, always undaunted. She would ride with him on horseback over the mountain trails till she was so tired she was nothing but a bodiless consciousness sitting astride her pony. But she never gave in. And at night he folded her in her blanket on a bed of balsam pine twigs, and she lay and looked at the stars unmurmuring. She was fulfilling her role, people said to her as the years passed, and she was a woman of 25, then a woman of 30, and always the same virgin dainty princess, knowing in a dispassionate way, like an old woman, and utterly intact. Don't you ever think what you will do when your father is no longer with you? She looked at her interlocutor with that cold, elfin detachment of hers. No, I never think of it, she said. She had a tiny, but exquisite little house in London, and another small, perfect house in Connecticut, each with a faithful housekeeper. 2 homes, if she chose. And she knew many interesting literary and artistic people. What more, so the years passed imperceptibly. And she had that quality of the sexless fairies, she did not change. At 33 she looked 23. Her father, however, was aging, and becoming more and more queer. It was now her task to be his guardian in his private madness. He spent the last 3 years of life in the house in Connecticut. He was very much estranged, sometimes had fits of violence which almost killed the little princess. Physical violence was horrible to her, it seemed to shatter her heart. But she found a woman a few years younger than herself, well-educated and sensitive, to be a sort of nurse companion to the mad old man. So the fact of madness was never openly admitted. Miss Cummins, the companion, had a passionate loyalty to the princess, and a curious affection, tinged with love, for the handsome, white-haired, courteous old man, who was never at all aware of his fits of violence once they had passed. The princess was 38 years old when her father died. And quite unchanged. She was still tiny, and like a dignified, scentless flower. Her soft brownish hair, almost the color of beaver fur, was bobbed, and fluffed softly round her apple blossom face, that was modeled with an arched nose like a proud old Florentine portrait. In her voice, manner and bearing she was exceedingly still, like a flower that has blossomed in a shadowy place. And from her blue eyes looked out the princess's eternal laconic challenge, that grew almost sardonic as the years passed. She was the princess, and sardonically she looked out on a princeless world. She was relieved when her father died, and at the same time, it was as if everything had evaporated around her. She had lived in a sort of hothouse, in the aura of her father's madness. Suddenly the hothouse had been removed from around her, and she was in the raw, vast, vulgar open air. Coiffure? What was she to do? She seemed faced with absolute nothingness. Only she had Miss Cummins, who shared with her the secret, and almost the passion for her father. In fact, the princess felt that her passion for her mad father had in some curious way transferred itself largely to Charlotte Cummins during the last years. And now Miss Cummins was the vessel that held the passion for the dead man. She herself, the princess, was an empty vessel in the enormous warehouse of the world. Coiffure? What was she to do? She felt that, since she could not evaporate into nothingness, like alcohol from an unstoppered bottle, she must do something. Never before in her life had she felt the incumbency. Never had she felt she must do anything. That was left to the vulgar. Now her father was dead, she found herself on the fringe of the vulgar crowd, sharing their necessity to do something. It was a little humiliating. She felt herself becoming vulgarized. At the same time she found herself looking at men with a shrewder eye, an eye to marriage. Not that she felt any sudden interest in men, or attraction towards them. No. She was still neither interested nor attracted towards men vitally. But marriage, that peculiar abstraction, had imposed a sort of spell on her. She thought that marriage, in the blank abstract, was the thing she ought to do. That marriage implied a man she also knew. She knew all the facts. But the man seemed a property of her own mind rather than a thing in himself. Another thing, her father died in the summer, the month after her 38th birthday. When all was over, the obvious thing to do, of course, was to travel with Miss Cummins. The two women knew each other intimately, but they were always Miss Urquhart and Miss Cummins to one another, and a certain distance was instinctively maintained. Miss Cummins, from Philadelphia, of scholastic stock, and intelligent but untraveled, 4 years younger than the princess, felt herself immensely the junior of her lady. She had a sort of passionate veneration for the princess, who seemed to her ageless, timeless. She could not see the rows of tiny, dainty, exquisite shoes in the princess's cupboard without feeling a stab at the heart, a stab of tenderness and reverence, almost of awe. Miss Cummins also was virginal, but with a look of puzzled surprise in her brown eyes. Her skin was pale and clear, her features well modeled, but there was a certain blankness in her expression, where the princess had an odd touch of Renaissance grandeur. Miss Cummins's voice was also hushed almost to a whisper. It was the inevitable effect of Colin Urquhart's room. But the hushedness had a hoarse quality. The princess did not want to go to Europe. Her face seemed turned west. Now her father was gone, she felt she would go westwards, as if forever. Following, no doubt, the march of empire, which is brought up rather short on the Pacific coast, among swarms of wallowing bathers. No, not the Pacific coast. She would stop short of that. The Southwest was less vulgar. She would go to New Mexico. She and Miss Cummins arrived at the Rancho del Cerro Gordo towards the end of August, when the crowd was beginning to drift back east. The ranch lay by a stream on the desert some 4 miles from the foot of the mountains, a mile away from the Indian pueblo of San Cristobal. It was a ranch for the rich. The princess paid $30 a day for herself and Miss Cummins. But then she had a little cottage to herself, among the apple trees of the orchard, with an excellent cook. She and Miss Cummins, however, took dinner at evening in the large guest house. For the princess still entertained the idea of marriage. The guests at the Rancho del Cerro Gordo were of all sorts, except the poor sort. They were practically all rich, and many were romantic. Some were charming, others were vulgar, some were movie people, quite quaint and not unattractive in their vulgarity, and many were Jews. The princess did not care for Jews, though they were usually the most interesting to talk to. So she talked a good deal with the Jews, and painted with the artists, and rode with the young men from college, and had altogether quite a good time. And yet she felt something of a fish out of water, or a bird in the wrong forest. And marriage remained still completely in the abstract. No connecting it with any of these young men, even the nice ones. The princess looked just 25. The freshness of her mouth, the hushed, delicate complexioned virginity of her face gave her not a day more. Only a certain laconic look in her eyes was disconcerting. When she was forced to write her age, she put 28, making the figure 2 rather badly, so that it just avoided being a 3. Men hinted marriage at her. Especially boys from college suggested it from a distance. But they all failed before the look of sardonic ridicule in the princess's eyes. It always seemed to her rather preposterous, quite ridiculous, and a tiny bit impertinent on their part. The only man that intrigued her at all was one of the guides, a man called Domingo Romero. It was he who had sold the ranch itself to the Wilkersons 10 years before, for $2,000. He had gone away, then reappeared at the old place. For he was the son of the old Romero, the last of the Spanish family that had owned miles of land around San Cristobal. But the coming of the white man and the failure of the vast flocks of sheep, and the fatal inertia which overcomes all men, at last, on the desert near the mountains, had finished the Romero family. The last descendants were just Mexican peasants. Domingo, the heir, had spent his $2,000, and was working for white people. He was now about 30 years old, a tall, silent fellow, with a heavy closed mouth and black eyes that looked across at one almost sullenly. From behind he was handsome, with a strong, natural body, and the back of his neck very dark and well-shapen, strong with life. But his dark face was long and heavy, almost sinister, with that peculiar heavy meaninglessness in it, characteristic of the Mexicans of his own locality. They are strong, they seem healthy. They laugh and joke with one another. But their physique and their natures seem static, as if there were nowhere at all for their energies to go, and their faces, degenerating to misshapen heaviness, seemed to have no raison d'etre, no radical meaning. Waiting either to die or to be aroused into passion and hope. In some of the black eyes a queer, haunting mystic quality, somber and a bit gruesome, the skull and crossbones look of the penitents. They had found their raison d'etre in self-torture and death worship. Unable to wrest a positive significance for themselves from the vast, beautiful, but vindictive landscape they were born into, they turned on their own selves, and worshipped death through self-torture. The mystic gloom of this showed in their eyes, but as a rule the dark eyes of the Mexicans were heavy and half alive, sometimes hostile, sometimes kindly, often with the fatal Indian glaze on them, or the fatal Indian glint. Domingo Romero was almost a typical Mexican to look at, with the typical heavy, dark, long face, clean-shaven, with an almost brutally heavy mouth. His eyes were black and Indian-looking. Only, at the center of their hopelessness was a spark of pride, or self-confidence, or dauntlessness. Just a spark in the midst of the blackness of static despair, but this spark was the difference between him and the mass of men. It gave a certain alert sensitiveness to his bearing and a certain beauty to his appearance. He wore a low-crowned black hat, instead of the ponderous headgear of the usual Mexican, and his clothes were thinnish and graceful. Silent, aloof, almost imperceptible in the landscape, he was an admirable guide, with a startling quick intelligence that anticipated difficulties about to rise. He could cook, too, crouching over the campfire and moving his lean deft brown hands. The only fault he had was that he was not forthcoming, he wasn't chatty and cozy. "Oh, don't send Romero with us," the Jews would say. One can't get any response from him. Tourists come and go, but they rarely see anything, inwardly. None of them ever saw the spark at the middle of Romero's eye, they were not alive enough to see it. The princess caught it one day, when she had him for a guide. She was fishing for trout in the canyon, Miss Cummins was reading a book, the horses were tied under the trees, Romero was fixing a proper fly on her line. He fixed the fly and handed her the line, looking up at her. And at that moment she caught the spark in his eye. And instantly she knew that he was a gentleman, that his demon, as her father would have said, was a fine demon. And instantly her manner towards him changed. He had perched her on a rock over a quiet pool, beyond the cottonwood trees. It was early September, and the canyon already cool, but the leaves of the cottonwoods were still green. The princess stood on the rock, a small but perfectly formed figure, wearing a soft, close gray sweater and neatly cut gray riding breeches, with tall black boots, her fluffy brown hair straggling from under a little gray felt hat. A woman? Not quite. A changeling of some sort, perched in outline there on the rock, in the bristling wild canyon. She knew perfectly well how to handle a line. Her father had made a fisherman of her. Romero, in a black shirt and with loose black trousers pushed into wide black riding boots, was fishing a little further down. He had put his hat on a rock behind him, his dark head was bent a little forward, watching the water. He had caught 3 trout. From time to time he glanced upstream at the princess, perched there so daintily. He saw she had caught nothing. Soon he quietly drew in his line and came up to her. His keen eye watched her line, watched her position. Then, quietly, he suggested certain changes to her, putting his sensitive brown hand before her. And he withdrew a little, and stood in silence, leaning against a tree, watching her. He was helping her across the distance. She knew it, and thrilled. And in a moment she had a bite. In 2 minutes she landed a good trout. She looked round at him quickly, her eyes sparkling, the color heightened in her cheeks. And as she met his eyes a smile of greeting went over his dark face, very sudden, with an odd sweetness. She knew he was helping her. And she felt in his presence a subtle, insidious male kindliness she had never known before waiting upon her. Her cheek flushed, and her blue eyes darkened. After this, she always looked for him, and for the curious dark beam of a man's kindliness which he could give her, as it were, from his chest, from his heart. It was something she had never known before. A vague, unspoken intimacy grew up between them. She liked his voice, his appearance, his presence. His natural language was Spanish. He spoke English like a foreign language, rather slow, with a slight hesitation, but with a sad, plangent sonority lingering over from his Spanish. There was a certain subtle correctness in his appearance. He was always perfectly shaved, his hair was thick and rather long on top, but always carefully groomed behind. And his fine black cashmere shirt, his wide leather belt, his well-cut, wide black trousers going into the embroidered cowboy boots had a certain inextinguishable elegance. He wore no silver rings or buckles. Only his boots were embroidered and decorated at the top with an inlay of white suede. He seemed elegant, slender, yet he was very strong, and at the same time, curiously, he gave her the feeling that death was not far from him. Perhaps he too was half in love with death. However that may be, the sense she had that death was not far from him made him possible to her. Small as she was quite a good horsewoman. They gave her at the ranch a sorrel mare, very lovely in color, and well made, with a powerful broad neck and the hollow back that betokens a swift runner. Tansy, she was called. Her only fault was the usual mare's failing. She was inclined to be hysterical, so that every day the princess set off with Miss Cummins and Romero, on horseback, riding into the mountains. Once they went camping for several days, with 2 more friends in the party. "I think I like it better," the princess said to Romero, "when we 3 go alone," and he gave her one of his quick, transfiguring smiles. It was curious no white man had ever showed her this capacity for subtle gentleness, this power to help her in silence across a distance, if she were fishing without success, or tired of her horse, or if Tansy suddenly got scared. It was as if Romero could send her from his heart a dark beam of succor and sustaining. She had never known this before, and it was very thrilling. Then the smile that suddenly creased his dark face, showing the strong white teeth. It creased his face almost into a savage grotesque. And at the same time there was in it something so warm, such a dark flame of kindliness for her. She was elated into her true princess self. Then that vivid, latent spark in his eye, which she had seen, and which she knew he was aware she had seen. It made an entire recognition between them, silent and delicate. Here he was delicate as a woman in this subtle entire recognition, and yet his presence only put to flight in her the idée fixe of marriage. For some reason, in her strange little brain, the idea of marrying him could not enter. Not for any definite reason. He was in himself a gentleman, and she had plenty of money for 2. There was no actual obstacle. Nor was she conventional. No, now she came down to it, it was as if their 2 demons could marry, were perhaps married. Only their 2 selves, Miss Urquhart and Senor Domingo Romero, were for some reason incompatible. There was a peculiar subtle intimacy of entire recognition between them. But she did not see in the least how it would lead to marriage. Almost she could more easily marry one of the nice boys from Harvard or Yale. The time passed, and she let it pass. The end of September came, with aspens going yellow on the mountain heights, and oak scrub going red. But as yet the cottonwoods in the valley and canyons had not changed. "When will you go away?" Romero asked her, looking at her fixedly, with a blank black eye. "By the end of October," she said. "I have promised to be in Santa Barbara at the beginning of November." He was hiding the spark in his eye from her. But she saw the peculiar sullen thickening of his heavy mouth. She had complained to him many times that one never saw any wild animals, except chipmunks and squirrels, and perhaps a skunk and a porcupine. Never a deer, or a bear, or a mountain lion. "Are there no bigger animals in these mountains?" she asked, dissatisfied. "Yes," he said. "There are deer, I see their tracks. And I saw the tracks of a bear. But why can one never see the animals themselves?" She looked dissatisfied and wistful like a child. "Why, it's pretty hard for you to see them. They won't let you come close. You have to keep still, in a place where they come. Or else you have to follow their tracks a long way. I can't bear to go away till I've seen them, a bear, or a deer. The smile came suddenly on his face, indulgent. Well, what do you want? Do you want to go up into the mountains to some place, to wait till they come? Yes, she said, looking up at him with a sudden naive impulse of recklessness. And immediately his face became somber again. Responsible. Well, he said, with slight irony, a touch of mockery of her. You will have to find a house. It's very cold at night now. You would have to stay all night in a house, and there are no houses up there? She said. Yes, he replied. There is a little shack that belongs to me, that a miner built a long time ago, looking for gold. You can go there and stay one night, and maybe you see something. Maybe. I don't know. Maybe nothing come. How much chance is there? Well, I don't know. Last time when I was there I see 3 deer come down to drink at the water, and I shot 2 raccoons. But maybe this time we don't see anything. Is the water there? She asked. Yes, there is a little round pond, you know, below the spruce trees. And the water from the snow runs into it. Is it far away? She asked. Yes, pretty far. You see that ridge there, and turning to the mountains he lifted his arm in the gesture which is somehow so moving, out in the west, pointing to the distance, that ridge where there are no trees, only rock. His black eyes were focused on the distance, his face impassive, but as if in pain. You go round that ridge, and along, then you come down through the spruce trees to where that cabin is. My father bought that place a claim from a miner who was broke, but nobody ever found any gold or anything, and nobody ever goes there. Too lonesome. The princess watched the massive, heavy-sitting, beautiful bulk of the Rocky Mountains. It was early in October, and the aspens were already losing their gold leaves. High up, the spruce and pine seemed to be growing darker. The great flat patches of oak scrub on the heights were red like gore. Can I go over there? She asked, turning to him and meeting the spark in his eye. His face was heavy with responsibility. Yes, he said, you can go. But there'll be snow over the ridge, and it's awful cold, and awful lonesome. I should like to go, she said, persistent. All right, he said. You can go if you want to. She doubted, though, if the Wilkersons would let her go, at least alone with Romero and Miss Cummins. Yet an obstinacy characteristic of her nature, an obstinacy tinged perhaps with madness, had taken hold of her. She wanted to look over the mountains into their secret heart. She wanted to descend to the cabin below the spruce trees, near the dun of bright green water. She wanted to see the wild animals move about in their wild unconsciousness. Let us say to the Wilkersons that we want to make the trip round the Frijoles Canyon, she said. The trip round the Frijoles Canyon was a usual thing. It would not be strenuous, nor cold, nor lonely. They could sleep in the log house that was called an hotel. Romero looked at her quickly. If you want to say that, he replied, you can tell Mrs. Wilkerson. Only I know she'll be mad with me if I take you up in the mountains to that place. And I've got to go there first with a pack horse, to take lots of blankets and some bread. Maybe Miss Cummins can't stand it. Maybe not. It's a hard trip. He was speaking, and thinking, in the heavy, disconnected Mexican fashion. Never mind. The princess was suddenly very decisive and stiff with authority. I want to do it. I will arrange with Mrs. Wilkerson. And we'll go on Saturday. He shook his head slowly. I've got to go up on Sunday with a pack horse and blankets, he said. Can't do it before. Very well, she said, rather piqued. Then we'll start on Monday. She hated being thwarted even the tiniest bit. He knew that if he started with the pack on Sunday at dawn he would not be back until late at night. But he consented that they should start on Monday morning at 7. The obedient Miss Cummins was told to prepare for the Frijoles trip. On Sunday Romero had his day off. He had not put in an appearance when the princess retired on Sunday night, but on Monday morning, as she was dressing, she saw him bringing in the 3 horses from the corral. She was in high spirits. The night had been cold. There was ice at the edges of the irrigation ditch, and the chipmunks crawled into the sun and lay with wide, dumb, anxious eyes, almost too numb to run. We may be away 2 or 3 days, said the princess. Very well. We won't begin to be anxious about you before Thursday, then, said Mrs. Wilkerson, who was young and capable, from Chicago. Anyway, she added, Romero will see you through. He's so trustworthy. The sun was already on the desert as they set off towards the mountains, making the greasewood and the sage pale as pale gray sands, luminous the great level around them. To the right glinted the shadows of the adobe pueblo, flat and almost invisible on the plain, earth of its earth. Behind lay the ranch and the tufts of tall, plumy cottonwoods, whose summits were yellowing under the perfect blue sky, autumn breaking into color in the great bases of the southwest. But the three trotted gently along the trail, towards the sun that sparkled yellow just above the dark bulk of the ponderous mountains. Side slopes were already gleaming yellow, flaming with a second light, under coldish blue of the pale sky. The front slopes were in shadow, with submerged luster of red oak scrub and dull gold aspens, blue-black pines and grey-blue rock. While the canyon was full of a deep blueness, they rode single file, Romero first, on a black horse. Himself in black, made a flickering black spot in the delicate pallor of the great landscape, where even pine trees at a distance take a film of blue paler than their green. Romero rode on in silence past the tufts of fairy greasewood. The princess came next, on her sorrel mare. And Miss Cummins, who was not quite happy on horseback, came last, in the pale dust that the others kicked up. Sometimes her horse sneezed, and she started, but on they went at a gentle trot. Romero never looked round. He could hear the sound of the hoofs following, and that was all he wanted. For the rest, he held ahead. And the princess, with that black, unheeding figure always travelling away from her, felt strangely helpless. Withal elated, they neared the pale, round foothills, dotted with the round dark pine and cedar shrubs. The horses clinked and trotted among the stones. Occasionally a big round greasewood held out fleecy tufts of flowers, pure gold. They wound into blue shadow, then up a steep stony slope, with the world lying pallid away behind and below. Then they dropped into the shadow of the San Cristobal Canyon. The stream was running full and swift. Occasionally the horses snatched at a tuft of grass. The trail narrowed and became rocky, the rocks closed in, it was dark and cool as the horses climbed and climbed upwards, and the tree trunks crowded in the shadowy, silent tightness of the canyon. They were among cottonwood trees that ran straight up and smooth and round to an extraordinary height. Above, the tips were gold, and it was sun. But away below, where the horses struggled up the rocks and wound among the trunks, there was still blue shadow by the sound of waters and an occasional grey festoon of old man's beard, and here and there a pale, dripping cranesbill flower among the tangle and the debris of the virgin place. And again the chill entered the princess's heart as she realized what a tangle of decay and despair lay in the virgin forests. They scrambled downwards, splashed across stream, up rocks and along the trail of the other side. Romero's black horse stopped, looked down quizzically at the fallen trees, then stepped over lightly. The princess's sorrel followed, carefully. But Miss Cummins's buckskin made a fuss, and had to be got round, in the same silence, save for the clinking of the horses and the splashing as the trail crossed stream. They worked their way upwards in the tight, tangled shadow of the canyon. Sometimes, crossing stream, the princess would glance upwards, and then always her heart caught in her breast. For high up, away in heaven, the mountain heights shone yellow, dappled with dark spruce firs, clear almost as speckled daffodils against the pale turquoise blue lying high and serene above the dark blue shadow where the princess was. And she would snatch at the blood-red leaves of the oak as her horse crossed a more open slope, not knowing what she felt. They were getting fairly high, occasionally lifted above the canyon itself, in the low groove below the speckled, gold-sparkling heights which towered beyond. Then again they dipped and crossed stream, the horses stepping gingerly across a tangle of fallen, frail aspen stems, then suddenly floundering in a mass of rocks. The black emerged ahead, his black tail waving. The princess let her mare find her own footing, then she too emerged from the clatter. She rode on after the black. Then came a great frantic rattle of the buckskin behind. The princess was aware of Romero's dark face looking round, with a strange, demon-like watchfulness, before she herself looked round, to see the buckskin scrambling rather lamely beyond the rocks, with one of his pale buff knees already red with blood. He almost went down. Called Miss Cummins. But Romero was already out of the saddle and hastening down the path. He made quiet little noises to the buckskin, and began examining the cut knee. "Is he hurt?" cried Miss Cummins anxiously, and she climbed hastily down. "Oh, my goodness!" she cried, as she saw the blood running down the slender buff leg of the horse in a thin trickle. "Isn't that awful?" She spoke in a stricken voice, and her face was white. Romero was still carefully feeling the knee of the buckskin. Then he made him walk a few paces. And at last he stood up straight and shook his head. "Not very bad," he said. "Nothing broken." Again he bent and worked at the knees. Then he looked up at the princess. "He can go on," he said. "It's not bad." The princess looked down at the dark face in silence. "What, go on right up here?" cried Miss Cummins. "How many hours?" "About 5," said Romero simply. "5 hours," cried Miss Cummins. "A horse with a lame knee. And a steep mountain. Why, yes, "It's pretty steep up there," said Romero, pushing back his hat and staring fixedly at the bleeding knee. The buckskin stood in a stricken sort of dejection. "But I think he'll make it all right," the man added. "Oh!" cried Miss Cummins, her eyes bright with sudden passion of unshed tears. "I wouldn't think of it. I wouldn't ride him up there, not for any money." "Why wouldn't you?" asked Romero. "It hurts him." Romero bent down again to the horse's knee. "Maybe it hurts him a little," he said. "But he can make it all right, and his leg won't get stiff." "What? Ride him 5 hours up the steep mountains?" cried Miss Cummins. "I couldn't. I just couldn't do it. I'll lead him a little way and see if he can go. But I couldn't ride him again. I couldn't. Let me walk." "But Miss Cummins, dear, if Romero says he'll be all right," said the princess, "I know it hurts him." "Oh, I just couldn't bear it." There was no doing anything with Miss Cummins. The thought of a hurt animal always put her into a sort of hysterics. They walked forward a little, leading the buckskin. He limped rather badly. Miss Cummins sat on a rock. "Why, it's agony to see him," she cried. "It's cruel. He won't limp after a bit, if you take no notice of him," said Romero. "Now he plays up, and limps very much, because he wants to make you see." "I don't think there can be much playing up," said Miss Cummins bitterly. "We can see how it must hurt him." "It don't hurt much," said Romero. But now Miss Cummins was silent with antipathy. It was a deadlock. The party remained motionless on the trail, the princess in the saddle, Miss Cummins seated on a rock, Romero standing black and remote near the drooping buckskin. "Well," said the man suddenly at last. "I guess we go back, then," and he looked up swiftly at his horse, which was cropping at the mountain herbage and treading on the trailing reins. "No!" cried the princess. "Oh no!" Her voice rang with a great wail of disappointment and anger. Then she checked herself. Miss Cummins rose with energy. "Let me lead the buckskin home," she said, with cold dignity, "and you two go on." This was received in silence. The princess was looking down at her with a sardonic, almost cruel gaze. "We've only come about 2 hours," said Miss Cummins. "I don't mind a bit leading him home. But I couldn't ride him. I couldn't have him ridden with that knee." This again was received in dead silence. Romero remained impassive, almost inert. "Very well, then," said the princess. "You lead him home. You'll be quite all right. Nothing can happen to you, possibly. And say to them that we have gone on and shall be home tomorrow or the day after." She spoke coldly and distinctly. For she could not bear to be thwarted. "Better all go back, and come again another day," said Romero non-committal. "There will never be another day," cried the princess. "I want to go on." She looked at him square into the eyes, and met the spark in his eye. He raised his shoulders slightly. "If you want it," he said, "I'll go on with you. But Miss Cummins can ride my horse to the end of the canyon, and I lead the buckskin. Then I come back to you." It was arranged so. Miss Cummins had her saddle put on Romero's black horse. Romero took the buckskin's bridle, and they started back. The princess rode very slowly on, upwards, alone. She was at first so angry with Miss Cummins that she was blind to everything else. She just let her mare follow her own inclinations. The peculiar spell of anger carried the princess on, almost unconscious, for an hour or so. And by this time she was beginning to climb pretty high. Her horse walked steadily all the time. They emerged on a bare slope, and the trail wound through frail aspen stems. Here a wind swept, and some of the aspens were already bare. Others were fluttering their discs of pure, solid yellow leaves, so nearly like petals, while the slope ahead was one soft, glowing fleece of daffodil yellow, fleecy like a golden fox skin, and yellow as daffodils alive and the wind and the high mountain sun. She paused and looked back. The near great slopes were mottled with gold and the dark hue of spruce, like some unseen eagle, and the light lay gleaming upon them. Away through the gap of the canyon she could see the pale blue of the egg-like desert, with the crumpled dark crack of the Rio Grande Canyon. And far, far off, the blue mountains like a fence of angels on the horizon, and she thought of her adventure. She was going on alone with Romero. But then she was very sure of herself, and Romero was not the kind of man to do anything to her against her will. This was her first thought. And she just had a fixed desire to go over the brim of the mountains, to look into the inner chaos of the Rockies. And she wanted to go with Romero, because he had some peculiar kinship with her. There was some peculiar link between the two of them. Miss Cummins anyhow would have been only a discordant note. She rode on, and emerged at length in the lap of the summit. Beyond her was a great concave of stone and stark, dead grey trees, where the mountain ended against the sky. But nearer was the dense black, bristling spruce, and at her feet was the lap of the summit, a flat little valley of sere grass and quiet standing yellow aspens, the stream trickling like a thread across. It was a little valley or shell from which the stream was gently poured into the lower rocks and trees of the canyon. Around her was a fairy-like gentleness, the delicate sere grass, the groves of delicate stemmed aspens dropping their flakes of bright yellow, and the delicate, quick little stream threading through the wild, sere grass. Here one might expect deer and fawns and wild things, as in a little paradise. Here she was to wait for Romero, and they were to have lunch. She unfastened her saddle and pulled it to the ground with a crash, letting her horse wander with a long rope. How beautiful Tansy looked, sorrel, among the yellow leaves that lay like a patina on the sere ground. The princess herself wore a fleecy sweater of a pale, sere buff, like the grass, and riding breeches of a pure orange tawny color. She felt quite in the picture. From her saddle pouches she took the packages of lunch, spread a little cloth, and sat to wait for Romero. Then she made a little fire. Then she ate a deviled egg. Then she ran after Tansy, who was straying across stream. Then she sat in the sun, in the stillness near the aspens, and waited. The sky was blue. Her little Alp was soft and delicate as fairyland. But beyond and up jutted the great slopes, dark with the pointed feathers of spruce, bristling with grey dead trees among grey rock, or dappled with dark and gold. The beautiful, but fierce, heavy cruel mountains, with their moments of tenderness. She saw Tansy start, and begin to run. Two ghost-like figures on horseback emerged from the black of the spruce across the stream. It was two Indians on horseback, swathed like seated mummies in their pale grey cotton blankets. Their guns jutted beyond the saddles. They rode straight towards her, to her thread of smoke. As they came near, they unswathed themselves and greeted her, looking at her curiously from their dark eyes. Their black hair was somewhat untidy. The long rolled plaits on their shoulders were soiled. They looked tired. They got down from their horses near her little fire. A camp was a camp, swathed their blankets round their hips, pulled the saddles from their ponies and turned them loose, then sat down. One was a young Indian whom she had met before, the other was an older man. "You all alone?" said the younger man. "Romero will be here in a minute," she said, glancing back along the trail. "Ah, Romero. You with him? Where are you going?" "Round the ridge," she said. "Where are you going?" "We going down to Pueblo." "Been out hunting?" "How long have you been out?" "Yes. Been out 5 days." The young Indian gave a little meaningless laugh. "Got anything?" "No. We see tracks of 2 deer but not got nothing." The princess noticed a suspicious-looking bulk under one of the saddles, surely a folded-up deer. But she said nothing. "You must have been cold," she said. "Yes, very cold in the night." "And hungry?" "Got nothing to eat since yesterday." "Eat it all up." And again he laughed his little meaningless laugh. Under their dark skins, the two men looked peaked and hungry. The princess rummaged for food among the saddle bags. There was a lump of bacon, the regular standback, and some bread. She gave them this, and they began toasting slices of it on long sticks at the fire. Such was the little camp Romero saw as he rode down the slope, the princess in her orange breeches, her head tied in a blue and brown silk kerchief, sitting opposite the two dark-headed Indians across the campfire, while one of the Indians was leaning forward toasting bacon, his 2 plaits of braid hair dangling as if wearily. Romero rode up, his face expressionless. The Indians greeted him in Spanish. He unsaddled his horse, took food from the bags, and sat down at the camp to eat. The princess went to the stream for water, and to wash her hands. "Got coffee?" asked the Indians. "No coffee this outfit," said Romero. They lingered an hour or more in the warm midday sun. Then Romero saddled the horses. The Indians still squatted by the fire. Romero and the princess rode away, calling adios to the Indians over the stream and into the dense spruce whence 2 strange figures had emerged. When they were alone, Romero turned and looked at her curiously, in a way she could not understand, with such a hard glint in his eyes. And for the first time she wondered if she was rash. "I hope you don't mind going alone with me," she said. "If you want it," he replied. They emerged at the foot of the great bare slope of rocky summit, where dead spruce trees stood sparse and bristling like bristles on a grey dead hog. Romero said the Mexicans, 20 years back, had fired the mountains, to drive out the whites. This grey concave slope of summit was corpse-like. The trail was almost invisible. Romero watched for the trees which the Forest Service had blazed. And they climbed the stark corpse slope, among dead spruce, fallen and ash-grey, into the wind. The wind came rushing from the west, up the funnel of the canyon, from the desert. And there was the desert, like a vast mirage tilting slowly upwards towards the west. immense and pallid, away beyond the funnel of the canyon. The princess could hardly look. For an hour their horses rushed the slope, hastening with a great working of the haunches upwards, and halting to breathe, scrambling again, and rowing their way up length by length, on the livid, slanting wall. While the wind blew like some vast machine, after an hour they were working their way on the incline, no longer forcing straight up. All was grey and dead around them. The horses picked their way over the silver-grey corpses of the spruce. But they were near the top, near the ridge. Even their horses made a rush for the last bit. They had worked round to a scrap of spruce forest near the very top. They hurried in, out of a huge, monstrous, mechanical wind, that whistled inhumanly and was palely cold. So, stepping through the dark screen of trees, they emerged over the crest. In front now was nothing but mountains, ponderous, massive, down-sitting mountains, in a huge and intricate knot, empty of life or soul. Under the bristling black feathers of spruce nearby lay patches of white snow. The lifeless valleys were concaves of rock and spruce, the rounded summits and the hog-backed summits of grey rock crowded one behind the other like some monstrous herd in arrest. It frightened the princess, it was so inhuman. She had not thought it could be so inhuman, so, as it were, anti-life. And yet now one of her desires was fulfilled. She had seen it, the massive, gruesome, repellent core of the Rockies. She saw it there beneath her eyes, in its gigantic, heavy gruesomeness, and she wanted to go back. At this moment she wanted to turn back. She had looked down into the intestinal knot of these mountains. She was frightened. She wanted to go back. But Romero was riding on the lee side of the spruce forest, above the concaves of the inner mountains. He turned round to her and pointed at the slope with a dark hand. "Here a miner has been trying for gold," he said. It was a grey scratched-out heap near a hole like a great badger hole. "And it looked quite fresh." "Quite lately?" said the princess. "No, long ago, 20, 30 years." He had reined in his horse and was looking at the mountains. "Look," he said. "There goes the Forest Service trail along those ridges, on the top, way over the till it comes to Lucytown, where is the government road. We go down the no trail. See behind that mountain you see the top, no trees, and some grass?" His arm was lifted, his brown hand pointing, his dark eyes piercing into the distance, as he sat on his black horse twisting round to her. Strange and ominous, only the demon of himself, he seemed to her. She was dazed and a little sick, at that height, and she could not see any more. Only she saw an eagle turning in the air beyond, and the light from the west showed the pattern on him underneath. "Shall I ever be able to go so far?" asked the princess faintly, petulantly. "Oh yes. All easy now. No more hard places." They worked along the ridge, up and down, keeping on the lee side, the inner side, in the dark shadow. It was cold. Then the trail laddered up again, and they emerged on a narrow ridge track, with the mountain slipping away enormously on either side. The princess was afraid. For one moment she looked out, and saw the desert ridges, more blue ridges, shining pale and very vast, far below, vastly palely tilting to the western horizon. It was ethereal and terrifying in its gleaming, pale, half-burnished immensity, tilted at the west. She could not bear it. To the left was the ponderous, involved mass of mountains, all that kneeling heavily. She closed her eyes and let her consciousness evaporate away. The mare followed the trail. So on and on, in the wind again, they turned their backs to the wind, facing inwards to the mountains. She thought they had left the trail, it was quite invisible. "No," he said, lifting his hand and pointing. "Don't you see the blazed trees?" And making an effort of consciousness, she was able to perceive on a pale grey dead spruce stem the old marks where an axe had chipped a piece away. But with the height, the cold, the wind, her brain was numb. They turned again and began to descend. He told her they had left the trail. The horses slithered in the loose stones, picking their way downward. It was afternoon, the sun stood obtrusive and gleaming in the lower heavens about 4 o'clock. The horses went steadily, slowly, but obstinately onwards. The air was getting colder. They were in among the lumpish peaks and steep concave valleys. She was barely conscious at all of Romero. He dismounted and came to help her from her saddle. She tottered, but would not betray her feebleness. "We must slide down here," he said. "I can lead the horses." They were on a ridge, and facing a steep bare slope of pallid, tawny mountain grass on which the western sun shone full. It was steep and concave. The princess felt she might start slipping, and go down like a toboggan into the great hollow, but she pulled herself together. Her eye blazed up again with excitement and determination. A wind rushed past her. she could hear the shriek of spruce trees far below. Bright spots came on her cheeks as her hair blew across. She looked a wild, fairy-like little thing. "No," she said. "I will take my horse, then mind she doesn't slip down on top of you," said Romero. And away he went, nimbly dropping down the pale, steep incline, making from rock to rock, down the grass, and following any little slanting groove. His horse hopped and slithered after him, and sometimes stopped dead, with 4 feet pressed back, refusing to go farther. He, below his horse, looked up and pulled the reins gently, and encouraged the creature. Then the horse once more dropped his 4 feet with a jerk, and the descent continued. The princess set off in blind, reckless pursuit, tottering and yet nimble. And Romero, looking constantly back to see how she was faring, saw her fluttering down like some queer little bird, her orange breeches twinkling like the legs of some duck, and her head, tied in the blue and buff kerchief, bound round and round like the head of some blue-topped bird. The sorrel mare rocked and slipped behind her. But down came the princess in a reckless intensity, a tiny, vivid spot on the great hollow flank of the tawny mountain. So tiny. Tiny as a frail bird's egg. It made Romero's mind go blank with wonder, but they had to get down, out of that cold and dragging wind. The spruce trees stood below, where a tiny stream emerged in stones. Away plunged Romero, zigzagging down. And away behind, up the slope, fluttered the tiny, bright-colored princess, holding the end of the long reins, and leading the lumbering, 4-footed, sliding mare. At last they were down. Romero sat in the sun, below the wind, beside some squawberry bushes. The princess came near, the color flaming in her cheeks, her eyes dark blue, much darker than the kerchief on her head, and glowing unnaturally. "We make it," said Romero. "Yes," said the princess, dropping the reins and subsiding onto the grass, unable to speak, unable to think. But, thank heaven, they were out of the wind and in the sun. In a few minutes her consciousness and her control began to come back. She drank a little water. Romero was attending to the saddles. Then they set off again, leading the horses still a little farther down the tiny stream bed. Then they could mount. They rode down a bank and into a valley grove dense with aspens. Winding through the thin, crowding, pale smooth stems, the sun shone flickering beyond them, and the disc-like aspen leaves, waving queer mechanical signals, seemed to be splashing the gold light before her eyes. She rode on in a splashing dazzle of gold. Then they entered shadow and the dark, resinous spruce trees. The fierce boughs always wanted to sweep her off her horse. She had to twist and squirm past, but there was a semblance of an old trail. And all at once they emerged in the sun on the edge of the spruce grove, and there was a little cabin, and the bottom of a small, naked valley with grey rock and heaps of stones, and a round pool of intense green water, dark green. The sun was just about to leave it. Indeed, as she stood, the shadow came over the cabin and over herself. They were in the lower gloom, at twilight. Above, the heights still blazed. It was a little hole of a cabin, near the spruce trees, with an earthen floor and an unhinged door. There was a wooden bed bunk, 3 old sawn-off log lengths to sit on as stools, and a sort of fireplace. No room for anything else. The little hole would hardly contain 2 people. The roof had gone, but Romero had laid on thick spruce boughs. The strange squalor of the primitive forest pervaded the place, the squalor of animals and their droppings, the squalor of the wild. The princess knew the peculiar repulsiveness of it. She was tired and faint. Romero hastily got a handful of twigs, set a little fire going in a stove grate, and went out to attend to the horses. The princess vaguely, mechanically, put sticks on the fire, in a sort of stupor, watching the blaze, stupefied and fascinated. She could not make much fire, it would set the whole cabin alight. And smoke oozed out of the dilapidated mud and stone chimney. When Romero came in with the saddle pouches and saddles, hanging the saddles on the wall, there sat the little princess on her stump of wood in front of the dilapidated fire grate, warming her tiny hands at the blaze, while her oranges breeches glowed almost like another fire. She was in a sort of stupor. "You have some whiskey now, or some tea? Or wait for some soup?" he asked. She rose and looked at him with bright, dazed eyes, half comprehending, the color glowing hectic in her cheeks. "Some tea," she said, "with a little whiskey in it." "Where's the kettle?" "Wait," he said. "I'll bring the things." She took her cloak from the back of her saddle, and followed him into the open. It was a deep cup of shadow. But above the sky was still shining, and the heights of the mountains were blazing with aspen like fire blazing. Their horses were cropping the grass among the stones. Romero clambered up a heap of grey stones and began lifting away logs and rocks, till he had opened the mouth of one of the miner's little old workings. This was his cache. He brought out bundles of blankets, pans for cooking, a little petrol camp stove, an axe, the regular camp outfit. He seemed so quick and energetic and full of force. This quick force dismayed the princess a little. She took a saucepan and went down the stones to the water. It was very still and mysterious, and of a deep green color, yet pure, transparent as glass. How cold the place was! How mysterious and fearful! She crouched in her dark cloak by the water, rinsing the saucepan, feeling the cold heavy above her, the shadow like a vast weight upon her, bowing her down. The sun was leaving the mountain tops, departing, leaving her under profound shadow. Soon it would crush her down completely. Sparks? Or eyes looking at her across the water? She gazed, hypnotized. And with her sharp eyes she made out in the dusk the pale form of a bobcat crouching by the water's edge, pale as the stones among which it crouched, opposite. And it was watching her with cold, electric eyes of strange intentness, a sort of cold, icy wonder and fearlessness. She saw its mousse pushed forward, its tufted ears pricking intensely up. It was watching her with cold, animal curiosity, something demonish and conscienceless. She made a swift movement, spilling her water. And in a flash the creature was gone, leaping like a cat that is escaping, but strange and soft in its motion, with its little bob tail. Rather fascinating. Yet that cold, intent, demonish watching. She shivered with cold and fear. She knew well enough the dread and repulsiveness of the wild. Romero carried in the bundles of bedding and the camp outfit. The windowless cabin was already dark inside. He lit a lantern, and then went out again with the axe. She heard him chopping wood as she fed sticks to the fire under her water. When he came in with an armful of oak scrub faggots, she had just thrown the tea into the water. "Sit down," she said, "and drink tea." He poured a little bootleg whiskey into the enamel cups, and in the silence the two sat on the log ends, sipping the hot liquid and coughing occasionally from the smoke. "We burn these oak sticks," he said. "They don't make hardly any smoke." Curious and remote he was, saying nothing except what had to be said. And she, for her part, was as remote from him. They seemed far, far apart, worlds apart, now they were so near. He unwrapped one bundle of bedding, and spread the blankets and the sheepskin in the wooden bunk. "You lie down and rest," he said, "and I make the supper." She decided to do so. Wrapping her cloak round her, she lay down in the bunk, turning her face to the wall. She could hear him preparing supper over the little petrol stove. Soon she could smell the soup he was heating, and soon she heard the hissing of fried chicken in a pan. "You eat your supper now?" he said, with a jerky, despairing movement. She sat up in the bunk, tossing back her hair. She felt cornered. "Give it me here," she said. He handed her first the cupful of soup. She sat among the blankets, eating it slowly. She was hungry. Then he gave her an enamel plate with pieces of fried chicken and currant jelly, butter and bread. It was very good. As they ate the chicken he made the coffee. She said never a word. A certain resentment filled her. She was cornered. When supper was over he washed the dishes, dried them, and put everything away carefully, else there would have been no room to move in the whole of a cabin. The oak wood gave out a good bright heat. He stood for a few moments at a loss. Then he asked her, "You want to go to bed soon?" "Soon," she said. "Where are you going to sleep?" "I make my bed here." He pointed to the floor along the wall. "Too cold out of doors?" "Yes," she said. "I suppose it is." She sat immobile, her cheeks hot, full of conflicting thoughts. And she watched him while he folded the blankets on the floor, a sheepskin underneath. Then she went out into night. The stars were big. Mars sat on the edge of a mountain, for all the world like the blazing eye of a crouching mountain lion. But she herself was deep, deep below in a pit of shadow. In the intense silence she seemed to hear the spruce forest crackling with electricity and cold. Strange, foreign stars floated on that unmoving water. The night was going to freeze. Over the hills came the far sobbing singing howling of the coyotes. She wondered how the horses would be. Shuddering a little, she turned to the cabin. Warm light showed through its chinks. She pushed at the rickety, half-open door. "What about the horses?" she said. "My black, he won't go away. And your mare will stay with him. You want to go to bed now?" "I think I do." "All right. I feed the horses some oats." And he went out into the night. He did not come back for some time. She was lying wrapped up tight in the bunk. He blew out the lantern, and sat down on his bedding to take off his clothes. She lay with her back turned. And soon, in the silence, she was asleep. She dreamed it was snowing, and the snow was falling on her through the roof, softly, softly, helplessly, and she was going to be buried alive. She was growing colder and colder, The snow was weighing down on her. The snow was going to absorb her. She awoke with a sudden convulsion, like pain. She was really very cold, perhaps the heavy blankets had numbed her. Her heart seemed unable to beat, she felt she could not move. With another convulsion she sat up. It was intensely dark. There was not even a spark of fire, the light would have burned right away. She sat in thick oblivious darkness. Only through a chink she could see a star. What did she want? Oh, what did she want? She sat in bed and rocked herself woefully. She could hear the steady breathing of the sleeping man. She was shivering with cold, her heart seemed as if it could not beat. She wanted warmth, protection, she wanted to be taken away from herself. And at the same time, perhaps more deeply than anything, she wanted to keep herself intact, untouched, that no one should have any power over her, or rights to her. It was a wild necessity in her that no one, particularly no man, should have any rights or power over her, that no one and nothing should possess her, yet that other thing. And she was so cold, so shivering, and her heart could not beat. Oh, would not someone help her heart to beat? She tried to speak, and could not. Then she cleared her throat. Romero, she said strangely, it is so cold. Where did her voice come from, and whose voice was it? In the dark, she heard him at once sit up, and his voice, startled, with a resonance that seemed to vibrate against her, saying, "You want me to make you warm?" Yes. As soon as he had lifted her in his arms, she wanted to scream to him not to touch her. She stiffened herself. Yet she was dumb, and he was warm, but with a terrible animal warmth that seemed to annihilate her. He panted like an animal with desire. And she was given over to this thing. She had never wanted to be given over to this. But she had willed that it should happen to her. And according to her will, she lay and let it happen. But she never wanted it. She never wanted to be thus assailed and handled, and mauled. She wanted to keep herself to herself. However, she had willed it to happen, and it had happened. She panted with relief when it was over, yet even now she had to lie within a hard, powerful clasp of this other creature, this man. She dreaded to struggle to go away. She dreaded almost too much the icy cold of that other bunk. "Do you want to go away from me?" asked his strange voice. Oh, if it could only have been 1,000 miles away from her. Yet she had willed to have it thus close. "No," she said, and she could feel a curious joy and pride surging up again in him, at her expense. Because he had got her. She felt like a victim there. And he was exulting in his power over her. His possession. His pleasure. When dawn came, he was fast asleep. She sat up suddenly. "I want a fire," she said. He opened his brown eyes wide, and smiled with a curious tender luxuriousness. "I want you to make a fire," she said. He glanced at the chinks of light. His brown face hardened to the day. "All right," he said. "I'll make it." She did her face while he dressed. She could not bear to look at him. He was so suffused with pride and luxury. She hid her face almost in despair. But feeling the cold blast of air as he opened the door, she wriggled down into the warm place where he had been. How soon the warmth ebbed. When he had gone, he made a fire and went out, returning after a while with water. "You stay in bed till the sun comes," he said. "It very cold. Hand me my cloak." She wrapped the cloak fast round her, and sat up among the blankets. The warmth was already spreading from the fire. "I suppose we will start back as soon as we've had breakfast?" He was crouching at his camp stove making scrambled eggs. He looked up suddenly, transfixed, and his brown eyes, so soft and luxuriously widened, looked straight at her. "You want to?" he said. "We'd better get back as soon as possible," she said, turning aside from his eyes. "You want to get away from me?" he asked, repeating the question of the night in a sort of dread. "I want to get away from here," she said decisively. And it was true. She wanted supremely to get away, back to the world of people. He rose slowly to his feet, holding the aluminium frying pan. "Don't you like last night?" he asked. "Not really," she said. "Why? Do you?" He put down the frying pan and stood staring at the wall. She could see she had given him a cruel blow. But she did not relent. She was getting her own back. She wanted to regain possession of all herself, and in some mysterious way she felt that he possessed some part of her still. He looked round at her slowly, his face grayish and heavy. "You Americans," he said, "you always want to do a man down." "I'm not American," she said. "I'm British. And I don't want to do any man down. I only want to go back now. And what will you say about me, down there? That you were very kind to me, and very good." He crouched down again, and went on turning the eggs. He gave her her plate, and her coffee, and sat down to his own food, but again he seemed not to be able to swallow. He looked up at her. "You don't like last night?" he asked. Not really, she said, though with some difficulty. I don't care for that kind of thing. A blank sort of wonder spread over his face at these words, followed immediately by a black look of anger, and then a stony, sinister despair. You don't? He said, looking her in the eyes. Not really, she replied, looking back with steady hostility into his eyes. Then a dark flame seemed to come from his face. I make you, he said, as if to himself. He rose and reached her clothes, that hung on a peg, the fine linen underwear, the orange breeches, the fleecy jumper, the blue and bluff kerchief. Then he took up her riding boots and her bead moccasins. Crushing everything in his arms, he opened the door. Sitting up, she saw him stride down to the dark green pool in the frozen shadow of that deep cup of a valley. He tossed the clothing and the boots out on the pool. Ice had formed. And on the pure, dark green mirror, in the slaty shadow, the princess saw her things lying. The white linen, the orange breeches, the black boots, the blue moccasins, a tangled heap of color. Romero picked up rocks and heaved them out at the ice, till the surface broke and the fluttering clothing disappeared in the rattling water, while the valley echoed and shouted again with the sound. She sat in despair among the blankets, hugging tight her pale blue cloak. Romero strode straight back to the cabin. Now you stay here with me, he said. She was furious. Her blue eyes met his. They were like two demons watching one another. In his face, beyond a sort of unrelieved gloom, was a demonish desire for death. He saw her looking round the cabin, scheming. He saw her eyes on his rifle. He took the gun and went out with it. Returning, he pulled out her saddle, carried it to the dun, and threw it in. Then he fetched his own saddle, and did the same. Now will you go away? He said, looking at her with a smile. She debated within herself whether to coax him and wheedle him. But she knew he was already beyond it. She sat among her blankets in a frozen sort of despair, hard as hard ice with anger. He did the chores, and disappeared with the gun. She got up in her blue pajamas, huddled in her cloak, and stood in the doorway. The dark green pool was motionless again, the stony slopes were pallid and frozen. Shadow still lay, like an after-death, deep in this valley. Always in the distance she saw the horses feeding. If she could catch one. The brilliant yellow sun was halfway down the mountain. It was 9 o'clock, all day she was alone, and she was frightened. What she was frightened of she didn't know. Perhaps the crackling in the dark spruce wood. Perhaps just the savage, heartless wildness of the mountains. But all day she sat in the sun in the doorway of the cabin, watching for hope. And all the time her bowels were cramped with fear. She saw a dark spot that probably was a bear, roving across the pale grassy slope in the far distance, in the sun, when, in the afternoon, she saw Romero approaching, with silent suddenness, carrying his gun and a dead deer. The cramp in her bowels relaxed, then became colder. She dreaded him with a cold dread. There is deer meat, he said, throwing the dead doe at her feet. You don't want to go away from here, he said. This is a nice place. She shrank into the cabin. Come into the sun, he said, following her. She looked up at him with hostile, frightened eyes. Come into the sun, he repeated, taking her gently by the arm, in a powerful grasp. She knew it was useless to rebel. Quietly he led her out, and seated himself in the doorway, holding her still by the arm. In the sun it is warm, he said. Look, this is a nice place. You are such a pretty white woman, why do you want to act mean to me? Isn't this a nice place? Come. Come here. It is sure warm here. He drew her to him, and in spite of her stony resistance, he took her cloak from her, holding her in her thin blue pajamas. You sure are a pretty little white woman, small and pretty, he said. You sure won't act mean to me. You don't want to, I know you don't. She, stony and powerless, had to submit to him. The sun shone on her white, delicate skin. I sure don't mind hellfire, he said. After this, a queer, luxurious good humor seemed to possess him again. But though outwardly she was powerless, inwardly she resisted him, absolutely and stonily. When later he was leaving her again, she said to him suddenly, You think you can conquer me this way? But you can't. You can never conquer me. He stood arrested, looking back at her, with many emotions conflicting in his face: wonder, surprise, a touch of horror, and an unconscious pain that crumpled his face till it was like a mask. Then he went out without saying a word, hung the dead deer on a bough, and started to flay it. While he was at this butcher's work, the sun sank and cold night came on again. You see, he said to her as he crouched, cooking the supper, I ain't going to let you go. I reckon you called to me in the night, and I've some right. If you want to fix it up right now with me, and say you want to be with me. We'll fix it up now and go down to the ranch tomorrow and get married or whatever you want. But you've got to say you want to be with me. Else I shall stay right here till something happens." She waited a while before she answered. "I don't want to be with anybody against my will. I don't dislike you, at least, I didn't, till you tried to put your will over mine. I won't have anybody's will put over me. You can't succeed. Nobody could. You can never get me under your will. And you won't have long to try, because soon they will send someone to look for me." He pondered this last, and she regretted having said it. Then, somber, he bent to the cooking again. He could not conquer her, however much he violated her, because her spirit was hard and flawless as a diamond. But he could shatter her. This she knew. Much more, and she would be shattered. In a somber, violent excess he tried to expend his desire for her. And she was racked with an agony, and felt each time she would die. Because, in some peculiar way, he had got hold of her, some unrealized part of her which she never wished to realize. Racked with a burning, tearing anguish, she felt that the thread of her being would break, and she would die. The burning heat that racked her inwardly, if only she could be alone again, cool and intact. If only she could recover herself again, cool and intact. Would she ever be able to bear herself again? Even now she did not hate him. It was beyond that. Like some racking, hot doom. Personally he hardly existed. The next day he would not let her have any fire, because of attracting attention with the smoke. It was a grey day, and she was cold. He stayed round, and heated soup on the petrol stove. She lay motionless in the blankets, and in the afternoon she pulled the clothes over her head and broke into tears. She had never really cried in her life. He dragged the blankets away and looked to see what was shaking her. She sobbed in helpless hysterics. He covered her over again and went outside, looking at the mountains, where clouds were dragging and leaving a little snow. It was a violent, windy, horrible day. The evil of winter rushing down. She cried for hours. And after this a great silence came between them. They were two people who had died. He did not touch her any more. In the night she lay and shivered like a dying dog. She felt that her very shivering would rupture something in her body, and she would die. At last she had to speak. "Could you make a fire?" "I am so cold," she said, with chattering teeth. "Want to come over here?" Came his voice. "I would rather you made me a fire," she said, her teeth knocking together and chopping the words in two. He got up and kindled a fire. At last the warmth spread, and she could sleep. The next day was still chilly, with some wind. But the sun shone. He went about in silence, with a dead-looking face. It was now so dreary and so like death she wished he would do anything rather than continue in this negation. If now he asked her to go down with him to the world and marry him, she would do it. What did it matter? Nothing mattered any more, but he would not ask her. His desire was dead and heavy like ice within him. He kept watch around the house. On the fourth day as she sat huddled in the doorway in the sun, hugged in a blanket, she saw two horsemen come over the crest of the grassy slope, small figures. She gave a cry. He looked up quickly and saw the figures. The men had dismounted. "They were looking for the trail." "They are looking for me," she said. "Muy bien," he answered in Spanish. He went and fetched his gun, and sat with it across his knees. "Oh," she said. "Don't shoot." He looked across at her. "Why?" he said. "You like staying with me?" "No," she said. "But don't shoot." "I ain't going to pen," he said. "You won't have to go to pen," she said. "Don't shoot." "I'm going to shoot," he muttered, and straightway he kneeled and took very careful aim. The princess sat on in an agony of helplessness and hopelessness. The shot rang out. In an instant she saw one of the horses on the pale grassy slope rear and go rolling down. The man had dropped in the grass, and was invisible. The second man clambered on his horse, and on that precipitous place went at a gallop in a long swerve towards the nearest spruce tree cover. Bang! Bang! Went Romero's shots. But each time he missed, and the running horse leapt like a kangaroo towards cover. It was hidden. Romero now got behind a rock, tense silence, in the brilliant sunshine. The princess sat on the bunk inside the cabin, crouching, paralyzed. For hours, it seemed, Romero knelt behind this rock, in his black shirt, bareheaded, watching. He had a beautiful, alert figure. The princess wondered why she did not feel sorry for him. But her spirit was hard and cold, her heart could not melt. Though now she would have called him to her, with love, but no, she did not love him. She would never love any man. Never. It was fixed and sealed in her, almost vindictively. Suddenly she was so startled she almost fell from the bunk. A shot rang out quite close from behind the cabin. Romero leapt straight into the air. His arms fell outstretched, turning as he leapt. And even while he was in the air, a second shot rang out, and he fell with a crash, squirming, his hands clutching the earth towards the cabin door. The princess sat absolutely motionless, transfixed, staring at the prostrate figure. In a few moments the figure of a man in the Forest Service appeared close to the house, a young man in a broad-brimmed Stetson hat, dark flannel shirt, and riding boots, carrying a gun. He strode over to the prostrate figure. "Got you, Romero," he said aloud. And he turned the dead man over. There was already a little pool of blood where Romero's breast had been. said the Forest Service man. "Guess I got you nearer than I thought," and he squatted there, staring at the dead man. The distant calling of his comrade aroused him. He stood up. "Hello, Bill?" he shouted. "Yep. Got him." "Yep. Done him in." Apparently, the second man rode out of the forest on a grey horse. He had a ruddy, kind face, and round brown eyes, dilated with dismay. "He's not passed out?" he asked anxiously. "Looks like it," said the first young man coolly. The second dismounted and bent over the body. Then he stood up again, and nodded. "Yay," he said. "He's done in all right." "It's him all right, boy. It's Domingo Romero." "Yep. I know it," replied the other. Then in perplexity he turned and looked into the cabin, where the princess squatted, staring with big owl eyes from her red blanket. "Hello," he said, coming towards the hut. And he took his hat off. Oh, the sense of ridicule she felt. Though he did not mean any, but she could not speak, no matter what she felt. "What did this man start firing for?" he asked. She fumbled for words, with numb lips. "He had gone out of his mind," she said, with solemn, stammering conviction. "Good Lord. You mean to say he'd gone out of his mind? Phew. That's pretty awful. That explains it then." He accepted the explanation without more ado. With some difficulty they succeeded in getting the princess down to the ranch. But she, too, was not a little mad. "I'm not quite sure where I am," she said to Mrs. Wilkerson, as she lay in bed. "Do you mind explaining?" Mrs. Wilkerson explained tactfully. "Oh yes," said the princess. "I remember. And I had an accident in the mountains, didn't I? Didn't we meet a man who'd gone mad, and who shot my horse from under me?" "Yes, you met a man who had gone out of his mind." The real affair was hushed up. The princess departed east in a fortnight's time, in Miss Cummins's care. Apparently she had recovered herself entirely. She was the princess, and a virgin intact, but her bobbed hair was grey at the temples, and her eyes were a little mad. "She was slightly crazy, since my accident in the mountains, when a man went mad and shot my horse from under me, and my guide had to shoot him dead. I have never felt quite myself," so she put it. Later, she married an elderly man, and seemed pleased.